Okay, actually, I'm going to pause it for a second. And my audio is being a little funky here, but we'll go with it. You guys can hear me okay, right? If you can hear me, then please give me the smiley face icon. If you can hear me okay. If you can hear me okay, cool. All right, let's go ahead and start. So today's topic is going to be the use of and in sentence correction. And as always, we got to start you off with a notice of copyright. Which is this, all the problems that we're going to use today are from the GMAT prep software, the free version, freeware version, not the paid one, which is copyright GMAC, free for distribution, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so this word, and, not exactly an obscure or uncommon word. The way in which it is used is very special when it comes to formal writing. So let's just talk about that for a moment. Let's say, here's a blank page. Let's say someone told you, like actually said to you out loud, this. They said to you, today there was much more traffic than usual, and I was late to work. Okay, in spoken language, what would this person probably mean in saying this? Like, what would they probably be blaming on what? Yeah, in spoken or informal language, this is probably the implication, right? Just because, number one, it's kind of common sense, but number two, we also, one hallmark of the spoken language is that we don't really spell out transitions very explicitly most of the time, because in most cases the transitions are really obvious. So in other words, you can get a lot of mileage out of spoken language even if you never use words like and or but or however. Nevertheless, moreover, even if you don't use those, you can still get a lot of mileage out of it. Now, here's the problem. Problem is, as you are all well aware, that this language is not the right language. This is not the language that's actually tested on this exam. So, has no relevance here. So instead, what this means, in the language of formal written English, which is the thing that is actually tested on this exam, is what Romy says. It actually does more than just not establish causality. It's not just a blank. Like, what it actually does is it specifically precludes causality. It specifically rules that out, which is what, when you say and like this. Wow, that's big. When you connect two things with just and in a formal written sentence, whether or not there's a comma, again, the punctuation is not, if you know this test, you'll know that punctuation doesn't figure in if you don't test punctuation. So that's not what we're thinking about here. But what this connector means is that these two things that are going to be orange are independent and separate. Like, they are not related in terms of cause and effect or sub-point or anything like that. The two orange things are independent or separate. And I mean, this clashes a lot of the time with spoken language, not always. I mean, a lot of the time we use it this way in spoken language too. But again, in spoken language, there's a lot of it is riding on the listener's understanding and common sense interpretation, and a lot less of that is a thing in the written language. So what this means in formal writing, the formal interpretation of this sentence would be something along the lines of, here are two bad things that happened to me. Different bad things. So, I mean, again, you might make assumptions that you make, but the sentence, the construction means what it means. And remember, it's probably the single thing that distinguishes the spoken language the most is that constructions mean stuff whether you want them to or not. You know, in spoken English, most constructions can mean whatever you want them to be as long as it's reasonably clear in context, but not here. So now notice that there's two ways that you can communicate this relationship if you want to, if you actually want to communicate a relationship. Then there's a couple ways you can do it. The first, not the first, but one way in which you can do it is to use adverbs in addition to and. So for instance, today there was much more traffic than usual, and blank, I was late to work. What adverb could I add in there? You could add thus. You could do that. There's others too. Thus. Any others? So, therefore, as a result, which is not just consequently, resultantly. I mean, all of these have very, very, very subtle differences in their usage, which are mostly style differences. Style differences don't matter on this test. So, as far as you're concerned, if any of these are present, then suddenly you are conveying this. Or you can also have a modifier. If you say, instead of connecting two independent observations with and, you can use a modifier instead. For example, you could have something like, yeah, there's still two bad things, but they're not two different bad things anymore. It's one bad thing, and then here's the consequence of that, which is even more badness, but it's a consequence. If you just say and, then the implication is that it is not a consequence. If you say, don't know what happened there. Okay. You could have something like the accident backed up the traffic for miles, comma, making me late to work. So you know how comma INGs work, at least if you don't, then you should be basically familiar with it. When you have comma ING, what we're doing is giving some sort of description of the whole main action that came before. So by backing up the traffic, the accident ultimately made me late for work. And that's cause and effect modifier conveys that sort of thing. I mean, these are not the only ways to do this, but the focus of today is is it appropriate to use and, or is it not appropriate to use and? So we'll get more into this in a moment. All right, because, what do you mean by because? Are you asking me a question? If you're asking me a question, then please clarify. Okay, let's go ahead and do a problem. How about this one? Okay. By the way, when you have multiple choice answers, please indicate them in the multiple choice answer area, which is here. Find your name, look underneath it, you should see A, B, C, D, E. Please do not answer in the chat box, both because that would get really crazy really quickly with as many people as there are here, and because we don't want other people to see your answer. Please click only once. If you click twice, you will actually erase the answer that you picked the first time. Okay, give this a shot. All right, let's pick a thing. If you don't already have a thing, pick a thing, please. Okay, let's take a look. All right, remember when you do sentence correction problems, what is step one? With any sentence correction problems, don't put the sentence correction problem in front of your face. What do you do first? Yeah, what you do first is you read a sentence and say, what the heck is even the message here? What are they even saying? And remember, that sounds like a very low-level, sort of trivial task, but it's not at all. I mean, remember, step number one is establish the intended meaning. But this is a very, at once, it's a very demanding task and not a very demanding task. It's demanding in the sense that you, after this step, after completing this step, you should understand every relationship that exists between any elements or among any elements of the sentence. I mean, that sounds like a lot. I mean, literally, if anything is related to anything else in any other way, you should understand it. But then you can realize this isn't really as big of a deal as it sounds like, because this is basically just reading like a normal person. Like if you were reading a book or a magazine and you read a sentence and you like saw that something caused something else, but you weren't sure what, you wouldn't keep reading. You'd be like, wait a minute, I didn't catch that. Then you'd go back and you would figure it out. You would go back though, it's point. You would sit on it until you figure it out. If there was a description, you didn't know what was being described, you would not continue to read until you had established what was being described. If there was an action and you didn't know who was doing it or what or to whom or to what it was being done, you would not continue until you had established that. And the common thread is you would not keep reading normal book or normal magazine until you knew exactly who did what and who did not do what else. So and as far as the test of this is concerned, the test is basically this. If you encounter a split that depends on meaning in the choices, the test of whether you are doing step one effectively is that you should not have to go back and figure out the relevant aspects of the meaning. You should already know what. So for example, today's theme is the use of and in sentence correction. If you come across this sort of thing, like are these two independent and separate things or are they not, you should already know whether they are or not. You should not have to go back and reread. I mean, you might have to think about it for a second, but it should be thinking about the meaning that you have already established in your head. So like, let's take a look at these three actions in the sentence. You have the ship ran aground, it leaked a bunch of oil and caused pollution. are those three separate things? How many separate deals are there here in those pink colored thingies? There's two, which are what and what else? Fundamentally separate things. There's two things, right? There's the running aground. I mean, this ship can run aground with or without spilling oil, right? So these are separate things that happen. So this is one thing. But then the pink colored stuff is another thing, and it's immediate and unavoidable consequence. I mean, you can't leak a bunch of cargo offshore in a coastal area without also polluting the beaches. That's not really a thing. So those are not two things. That's really one thing. It's consequence that was immediate. So this is another thing, and it's immediate, unavoidable, contemporaneous consequence. Contemporaneous, what does contemporaneous mean? I'm not usually a lover of big words, but what does this mean? Contemporaneous means nobody knows? Coordinate. It means in the same time frame. Yeah, is what that means. That's important because the modifier that's used here actually has to be in the same time frame. It cannot be a delayed consequence if we're going to use comma ing, which we'll get to in a second. But yeah, so we have one thing and then we have another thing and its immediate consequence. Like the act of leaking the cargo is the same as causing the pollution. Like those were the same act. Whereas the action of running aground and the action of spilling the oil are fundamentally not the same thing. So that's what you ask yourself here. I mean, it does. You could argue that running aground caused the ship to leak the oil, but those are still fundamentally different things. Whereas the same action of spilling the oil was also the action of polluting the beaches. Those were not separate. You could not separate those actions conceptually. So let's look at how they do this with connectors. Here they try to use comma ing. Let's use red for connectors. We'll try to use comma ing here. And then they used while here. It's kind of an ugly box. Let me erase that. Let me make a better box. Okay. They're trying to use comma ing on the left here, and here's while, here's and, here's with, here's and, here's comma ing, here's while, here's and here's and here's so that. Now remember what we had to say about and. If you're going to use and without qualifying adverbs like therefore or so or as a result or whatever, you should be signifying ultimately things that are different. They don't have to be totally independent. They just have to have separate existences from one another. So, like this. So let's take a look at whether that's satisfied or not. Well, So the oil barge ran aground and its cargo leaked into the ocean. That we can do that because those are separate. I mean, of course, those are not completely unrelated to each other, but ultimately they are two different things. Leaking doesn't work there because running aground, leaking is not contemporaneous and unavoidable. So, and we'll talk more about the comma ing thing here in a moment. But that's actually a very strict rule. In fact, let's divert for a second into that discussion. Let's talk about comma ing for a moment. So, what you should know about comma ing. Okay. So here's the sentence. If you've watched very many of these videos, you've definitely seen this exact sentence before because this is the sentence that I whip out whenever we talk about comma ing. But I dropped bags onto the floor, comma, scaring the dogs. Okay. Right. So there are lots of things, not lots, but there are a couple of things you need to be aware of here. There are things. So the first is that we are not describing the floor. Comma ings don't describe nouns. Instead, we're describing this entire action. You can call it describing the action or the clause because those are really the same thing. Like describing the dropping and describing I dropped the bags, there's no difference there because you can't divorce the action of dropping from the person who did it. So, but yeah, make sure you know it doesn't describe the noun. So not floor. Floors don't scare dogs. Dogs like floors. It describes the entire action, or the entire, if you prefer, the entirety of the previous clause. But what you also have to know is that ultimately we have to be describing the same action in the same time frame. And this is what also goes underappreciated. So like notice the act of scaring the dogs is a part of dropping the bags. You can't separate those from each other. Like they were not separate acts here. I mean, you couldn't conceptually separate. You couldn't say two things happened here. As opposed to the ship ran aground and spilled the oil. Yes, there's probably some relationship there, but those are still two things, ultimately speaking. So let me give you two more examples that should really clarify this. If you say this, the pedestrian was let's see, that the taxi jumped, occurred, and struck the pedestrian, killing him instantly. Or the pedestrian was struck by a runaway taxi cab, comma, dying instantly. These are correct sentences. Whereas, if I tried to give you something like this, if I say dying 20 minutes later in the hospital, then this is not okay. So make sure you understand why it isn't. Because now you got two different things. Because here in this case, this and this are the same act and the same time frame. So you could not actually separate those into two concepts. I mean, the striking of the pedestrian and the killing of the pedestrian in this sense are the same. Same action, same time frame. So comma ing works. Same sort of thing here. This is just the passive version of it, but same kind of thing. These are still the same. I mean, you could call this a consequence, but it's not a delayed consequence. It's like this is an immediate aspect of that. On the other hand, nope, not here, because the dying happened later. So even though it may have been a consequence, that's still not good enough for comma ing. So this was later, the different time frame. So not the same action or contemporaneous action. So therefore, comma ing cannot obtain here. And I mean, because again, this is why we have this comma ing thing. Because if you think about these kinds of situations, in spoken language, I mean, in spoken language, clearly there's no such thing as comma ing because there's no such thing as punctuation at all. But if you think about how you would navigate sentences like this one when you speak English, you would have to be very imprecise or very informal about it. Like you'd be like, oh, I dropped the bags and that scared the dog. Or the dogs got scared. Or, it scared the dogs, and you have to use words like it in ways that you're not allowed to. It's the informal language. So because we don't have this rectifies that lack of a construction for this type of thing in spoken language. So that's why it's okay to have comma polluting here. Because these are same act, same time frame. That's legit. Those are inseparable from each other. So comma ing works there. As opposed to ran aground and the cargo leaks. This also works because those really are two things. There's only two things with a relationship. At the end of the day, they have separate existences. So, two things. Well, but if it takes several hours to pollute, then it might also take several hours to leak, right? The leakage is the pollution. It's the same deal. So, okay. Now, if you look at the rest of these things, these ands don't work for the same reason that comma ing does work. Actually, all three of these are out for the same reason. Because it implies separateness of the action of polluting from the action of leaking oil, which doesn't make sense. There are other issues with these things. They're not the focus of today. But like while, for instance, in this kind of context means actually while, like actually during some other thing. So it didn't leak this stuff while polluting. So this is also bad. And it definitely didn't run aground while it was in the middle of leaking cargo. Also doesn't make sense. So, okay. Any other questions about this? It is leaking because they're not the same action, right? So it's wrong for the same reason this is wrong. So even though you have a causal effect there, it's not part of the same thing, and that has to do with the time frame observation. So, I mean, whether or not you can put words to it, it's the same as this. If you understand this example, then you also understand why choice A does not work. Okay. Cool. Let's look at, so this is C, C like cat. Let's take a look at another example. No, let's let me do that. Here's another one. As a hint, this one has a lot to do with all that stuff that we were just talking about. Go for it. And think step one, think very carefully about the meaning of the words. Okay, let's pick a thing. That is a thing. Most of you who don't have answers are away. Okay, but Daniel, Siraj, WL, Maruti, and Shue Yuan, which I probably pronounced very wrong. You should pick answers. Please. Okay, let's discuss. Step one, you got to figure out what the message is in the first place. Multiple choice answers, please put them where they belong. Thank you. That would be here. Yeah, that graphic, man, that's there for your edification. Underneath your name, menu. Let's see, it looks like this. That's where you pick the multiple choice answers. Okay. Following directions, that's the thing. On some data efficiency, especially, a lot of the test is actually a test of whether you can follow directions or not, so be very careful about that. All right, let's talk about it. So, meaning, well, we got two actions here that are described. The scientists did these things, and the question is, are they really two things? They found signs, they found evidence, basically, and then they concluded stuff. Are these two aspects of one action, or do they legitimately have separate existences as separate actions? They're separate, right? Because these are, I mean, of course, they're not completely unrelated to each other in the same sense as the pedestrian was struck by a taxi cab and then died later. I mean, the death was ultimately due to that accident, but they're still conceptually, they're separate verbs, separate actions. Like, these are not the same. Like, the scientists collected the evidence, and then after thinking about that evidence for a while, they concluded something later. So these are not the same thing. It's not like I dropped the bags onto the floor, comma, scaring the dogs. So, separate. You could have a sentence along similar lines in which we really did have two aspects of the same action. And I could make up one of those. Like if I say scientists have found signs that moving water existed on Mars in the planet's recent history, comma, disproving the idea that Mars has always been dry. This time, smiley face if you guys understand why this sentence would also be correct. Because this time, they're not separate things. Like finding these signs actually was the disproof. Because if you find evidence that there was water somewhere, then by finding that evidence, you have already disproved the idea that it was a dry place. So, those don't have tenses in the first place, so it's not a question that has a meaning. This is a modifier, which, I mean, especially given everything we've had to say about these modifiers, you can figure this out for sure, but this is contemporaneous with that, because it's actually the whole point of comma ing, is it is part of the same thing in the same time frame. And then moving is just an adjective, like the opposite of still or motionless. So adjectives don't have tenses either. So these are not things. These don't have tenses. Okay. In this case, you'd be looking at two aspects of the same action. But here, these are separate, because this is actively making a conclusion after mulling over the evidence in your head for a while. So, comma ing, no, does not work. Can't do it. Nope. Nope. These are out. All right. As far as the rest of these things, that's not really the point of today. So very, very briefly, without spending too much time on it. The and is okay in those other three. If you have 3 times as much, you have to have 3 times as much as. So if you were going to have a construction like what is in D, then this would have to be 3 times as much as, or more than. You could not eliminate either of these 2 words because you have to have the as to go with as much, and you have to have the than to go with more. And then that the planet's crust is harboring as opposed to harbors. Can somebody tell me what this means as opposed to this? Yeah, it is harboring. Means we're talking about something that is going on right now in the present. So there's a couple of problems here. And the first is that the first problem with is harboring is that we're not talking about that time frame. I mean, this means this is going on right now. And this is not what we mean. Because if you look at the sentence, you're actually talking about evidence from recent eras, which is still from the past. So we're not talking about what is going on right now, although we could be talking about general truths here. So then to figure out what this really means, this is back to step 1 again. What does harbor mean? Yeah, it's like it has a capacity of that much, or like it holds, right? You could say it holds, right? So harbor is to hold it. So, okay. Now there are 2 valid interpretations of this. Because remember, we're looking at evidence. Recent eras may be recent, but they are still history. They're just recent history. So the evidence is from the past. The evidence is not what's happening at this exact moment of the present. So the evidence is historical. So there's 2 ways that would make sense to interpret this. The first, so 2 sensible interpretations. First sensible interpretation would be that at that time, the crust harbored or held a certain amount of water. And, in other words, we're saying it has changed since then. So the crust harbored in the past or held in the past X amount of water. The other interpretation would be, in general, the crust harbors or holds X amount of water. Like it is a constant over the years. So, but by no means can we say, like, it's harboring right now, because then evidence from recent eras wouldn't tell us anything about that. When you say is verb ing, you're implying that this is a thing that is going on right now, but that is not a perpetual general sort of thing. Like the stock market is rising right now. That means like it doesn't always go up, but it's going up right now. And you can see why past stock results would not tell you that. So there's no past tense harbored in these choices. So of the interpretations that are here, is harboring doesn't make sense and harbors does. So C, like cat. E has some other weirdnesses in it, but they're just weirdnesses. They're not actual errors. The only thing that's really an actual problem in choice E is the tense is harboring. So, right. Also the coexistence of was and previously would be redundant. That's another problem another fault that you can find with E. You could say 3 times as was thought, or 3 times as much as was previously thought, but you don't need both of those words. Yeah, okay. See, that kind of thing, like the placement of this kind of modifier, there's a lot of flexibility to be had there. So I would be very cautious if I were you about making eliminations on that basis. Like if you, like let me just give you examples without even really trying to dig too far into why. If I gave you these things, let's say the pedestrian was struck by a taxi cab, and comma, 2 hours later, comma, died in the hospital. Okay, here are a couple other versions of this that would also be correct. If you had, I'm going to change these right now, I'll say I'm going to change them. You could have that. You could have this. You could also have this without commas, either way. The point is that there are a lot of places where you can put the modifier. So the lesson that I would give you is don't put too much weight on this, because especially when there are commas. Modifiers that are blocked off by commas have lots and lots of flexibility. A great deal of flexibility in the placement of modifiers with commas. And the decision is mostly stylistic. And what that means for you is that it is not an issue here, because style issues are not tested. Yeah. So Okay. In fact, here's some very useful general advice. Let me, maybe I'll find it in, paste it on the board. Let's see. Yeah, I should be able to find it here. Just a second. There it is. Okay. If you think something in a sentence is weird, very useful general advice here. It's going to be a graphic that pops up on the screen here in a moment. It might take a little bit because it is a rather large graphic file, but you'll see it momentarily. Okay, it's a flow chart. If you think that you see something that is weird, then ask yourself, do you actually know that it is wrong? It's a binary. It's either yes or no. Like either I am 100.00000% sure that it is wrong. Which, by the way, is unlikely, because if you knew that, you probably wouldn't be calling it weird. You would probably just call it wrong. So, but if that is true, then you should eliminate. On the other hand, if you are anywhere between 0% and 99.999999999% sure that it is wrong, then do not eliminate it. And more importantly, ignore and go find other stuff, because they do give you a variety of sentence structures in these problems. And predominantly, the purpose of giving you such a variety of sentence structures is to distract you from fundamentals. In other words, sentence correction is not something where you have to know like hundreds or even thousands of little small things. I mean, which is what a lot of people think it is, and those people are totally wrong. There's a smallish group of fundamental issues that are tested, and there's a much larger group of distractions. Which, I mean, the distractions, if you haven't seen them, if you have seen them, they're just ordinary sentence structures that are somewhat rare. But the point is that if you think that you see weirdness, then you should just ignore it unless you can decisively say that it is incorrect. Okay, so this is C like cat. You're welcome. And let's look at another problem. Come out. This. Don't forget step 1. They're doing different things with words like allow here. So make sure that before you go to the choices, make sure that you have an exact handle on what is going to allow what. That should happen before you even go to the choices. Okay, we need to pick a thing that is a thing. Remember, a big part of this exam is that you have to be efficient. That doesn't mean you have to be fast. And really mistaking efficiency for speed is one of the biggest mistakes that people make. You just have to not stare at things, basically, is what that means. You have to just make decisions and not make decisions. Okay, so let's look at, so again, the focal point of today is this notion of and versus, as opposed yet again to comma plus ing. I mean, certainly not the only thing that you could see that in contrast with, but that seems to be a common thread among these. We have and to stabilize, or and stabilizing, versus comma stabilizing. So, you know, I mean, actually, that is that a thing? Like, not only in this problem, but could you even write a sentence that had this in it? Is that possible? Like, is that even a thing? Or is that not a thing? I mean, remember what we've said about comma ing. What we've said about it is that, again, there's that big word that I tossed out there, but it's a word that is important in discussing this sort of thing. The point of comma ing is that it has to be contemporaneous with the thing that came before. So whatever was in the previous sentence. But then, of course, if you think about what the word then means, that's not true. Because that then is specifically saying not contemporaneous. So, there you go. So this is actually not a possible structure at all. I mean, you shouldn't just memorize this. You should understand why it's not possible. Because if you feel like you have to memorize this, then what that means is that you don't understand it well enough. Because it would be kind of like memorizing that annual plus next year is redundant. You know, like if you had to memorize that, that would mean you didn't really know what those words meant. Because if you knew what they meant, it would be really obvious to you that it was redundant, and there would be no need to memorize it. So, as a test of your understanding of comma ing, I mean, so this isn't possible. And if you understand comma ing well enough, this should be clear to you with no memorization required or even desired. Like, it should just be a thing that you realize if you understand the fundamentals of how those constructions work. I mean, there are also a couple of others. I mean, basically any transition that changes time frames is incompatible with this. So also not possible for the same reason. If you have this, comma, previously, comma ing, or this, or etc. Because notice the word now, you don't insert the word now into a sentence unless it actually changes the time frame. Like you don't gratuitously insert now. So if there's a sentence somewhere in the OG that's like, people have learned lots of stuff about some discipline. I forget what it is, but here's an incorrect sentence. People have learned a lot about. People have learned much in field X, comma, now answering previously unanswerable questions. This sentence does not work. Because notice this is not contemporaneous. The point is that once they have learned these things, now they can answer the questions. So one possible way to rewrite that would be having learned much in field X, comma, people are now answering previously unanswerable questions. This works. And I mean, notice a couple other things about this sentence. The first is that having learned is the way that you make an ing refer to the previous stuff. So, and then there's also the relationship. If you use an ing modifier, it's got, even if it's in front, it's got to relate to this whole clause and not just to people. And last but not least, there was the tense that we talked about on the other slide, are answering. And that's used here in a way that is totally perfect. It's referring to something that is going on right now and is not a timeless generality. This is something that is happening now, and specifically was not happening before. So, and that's exactly how that tense is used. And you can probably see how previously doesn't work with this either, because again, it's not contemporaneous. So, as soon as you see this kind of thing, you know it doesn't work. Because comma ing and then are at cross purposes. I mean, you can't. Those cannot coexist peacefully with each other. All right. Now, the other thing that you don't want to forget about and, like today the focus is on the meaning imparted by the word and, but the other thing that you should never forget about and is that it is a what, kind of. What is it? What mechanically does it bring? Yeah, it's a parallel structure. As long as, I mean, if you're using it to connect two whole sentences, then you don't need parallelism, at least not beyond requiring them both to be sentences. But, I mean, you don't forget the parallel aspect, right? So if here we're not connecting entire sentences, we're connecting pieces of sentences, and so those pieces absolutely must bar none be parallel. So stabilizing is problematic because nothing is parallel to it. I mean, again, step one, what goes with stabilize? Like, what is the first half of that? It's going to do what, and then it's going to stabilize. It's going to increase, and then it's going to stabilize. You don't have to have the word to there, although notice they didn't make this an issue. But right as written, the parallel structures are to increase and to stabilize. You could also just say to increase and stabilize. Although again, when there's enough words, it is easier to read if you have another to there. So C is not parallel. All right, now let's go back to the step one issue that I raised before. All right, what goes in those blanks? Here, let's color that. red. What goes in the blanks in the red thing? Like, what is actually going to allow what here? Remember, this should be established before you even look at answer choices. And it is not consistent with the way the original sentence is written, but that shouldn't matter at all, actually. Because who cares how the original sentence is written? Not you. Yeah, the extraction rate, we don't know what in the world is going to allow the extraction rate. Presumably some mining technology or another. But we don't know. They don't mention anything in the sentence that will allow the extraction rate to stabilize at that level. So if you ask yourself, what allows this extraction rate? Well, dude, I don't know. So, but we're not saying why that's true, though, right? We're just saying the yield is going to stabilize. If you're going to say allowing an extraction rate, you have to say why. I mean, saying the yield will stabilize and saying there's going to be an extraction rate that is constant are still the same mystery. It's still like, well, why though? What's true about the oil deposits, or what's true about the mining methods that are going to do that? On the other hand, what will allow 50 years production? Well, the extraction rate will. So that's what we mean here. What will allow production to continue for 50 years? The extraction rate will. So that's the meaning. So, and remember, this needs to be figured out before, not during, before the answer choices. Before you get to them, you need to figure this out. So, this is the answer to our question. We need to say that the extraction rate will allow. This is exactly what choice B says. It is not what choice A says. Choice A doesn't say anything will allow the extraction rate. In fact, quizzically enough, choice A says that the extraction rate will allow the extraction rate. That doesn't make a lot of sense. So remember, but step one is up front. And if you do step one up front, then you don't have to contend with this issue. You'll know which way it's supposed to go. So this is B like boy. About that. All right, let's see if we can knock out one more on fast forward, so to speak. I got a few more of these, so we can probably spill over into the next study hall session as well. But let's all right, let's pick a thing that is a thing. Okay. You have to make a guess. Make a guess. Okay. When you do step one, you should think about step one. It includes relationships and stuff that are explicit and what have you. But it also includes more generalized notions of how the sentence should and should not be written. as long as those are precise enough ideas. Like, let's say that you just read step 1 up to this point. Does anybody have any opinions on that much of the current version? She has written a computer textbook in Spanish for people who speak Spanish. Do you think that's a good sentence? It's not a good sentence. Yeah, it's a redundant sentence. I mean, this is very much the same as saying annual per year, right? It's just, this is redundant. Yeah, I mean, if you don't see why that is so, then here are a couple more examples. So I say I wrote a bicycle repair manual for those who wish to repair bicycles. I mean, you're going to look at me like, dude, who else would you possibly do that for? Yeah, or I teach tango to people who want to learn to dance the tango. You get the point. So this is still redundancy. It's not like semantic redundancy of, it's not like exactly like saying annual and per year, but it is, yeah, because there are definitely toys that are not for children. So yeah, that's totally okay, right? There are toys for developmentally disabled people. There are toys for adults. There are toys for lovers. There are toys for all kinds of people who are not children. There are toys for dogs. You get the point. So it is absolutely false that only children use toys. I mean, I played my Nintendo Game Boy every time I'm on an airplane. And I'm 40. So, yeah, you get the point. So on the other hand, no one would ever possibly use a bicycle repair manual unless they wanted to repair a bicycle. Similarly, Spanish manuals are only for people who actually know Spanish. You get the point. All right, so that's bad. In step 1, you should realize that this is bad. I mean, as you read that, you should be like, what do you mean, dude? Because if someone said that to you, then, I mean, obviously the form of the spoken language would be different, but if somebody said this to you, you would give, if it was your friend, you would give them that. You would probably, like, smack them on the head and be like, duh, well, of course it's for them, dude. Who else would it be for? So, this is bad. And during step 1, you should realize this. You should realize this is bad. Okay. And then there's, okay, now let's talk about the rest of the sentence. So these are out anyway. This is double out because it's still the same problem, but also this ing is like for people who are actually speaking it in the time frame of the sentence. So that's also bad. Like at least this is the present tense is at least the right tense to write this in, because this is a generality. They don't have to be doing it right now. But people speaking Spanish are people doing that in the time frame of the sentence. Whereas people who speak Spanish are just people who have that ability in general. Okay, but the focus of today is this and thing. So this is not an and type of situation. It's not they speak Spanish and, or it's not she has written the book and they don't have to rely on translation. So, and the adverbs here play a role. We have a then and we have a so. Now notice, we've already eliminated A for reasons that are clear. But what we should think about for a moment is whether, because again, we need to be precise. And let's ask ourselves whether this is a precise enough conveyance of the meaning that we want. So what this says basically is she has written the book, and so people who speak Spanish, and so those people, I mean they, right, so people who speak Spanish do not have to rely on translations from English. So the question is whether this is really the right connection. I mean, it's not totally off base, but if you think about it, it's not very precise. You know, like she has written the book, and all of a sudden, magically, these people don't have to rely on translations anymore, right? I mean, it would be more like she has written the book, and so an option is available in these people's own language, which is more, that's more of a direct causation type of thing. You know, because it's not she wrote the book and then magically that directly caused the fact that they no longer have to rely on English. On the other hand, if you think about what so that does, so that is her intention. So that means she wants this to happen, right? Like I mean, her intention, Deborah's intention was to free these speakers from the burden of relying on translation. And that's exactly what the intended meaning is. So that's also a thing. I mean, notice, you know, I mean, in A, if you notice that it just says, well, it's a computer textbook in Spanish for people who speak Spanish, you can be like, no, redundant. But you can also, that's not a thing. I mean, this and then, that implies that these are just two random things in succession. Because then is not a cause and effect thing. I went to the grocery store and then I went to the restaurant. That doesn't convey the idea at all. Also, I thought about this for a little bit while you guys were working on this problem, but I also I can't really make a decent sentence that puts two different tenses in connection with then. So first of all, I mean, this should be clear that it doesn't make sense because this doesn't convey the relationship at all. Like, it's just thing number one happens, and then thing number two, which has no discernible relationship to thing number one. Happened. That's not the point. I'm going to go ahead and just write this down, even though I'm not 100% sure of it, but just from my brief. So the internet is being weird. I'm going to write this here, even though I'm not 100% sure that it's always a thing. But I can't think of a way to do this. I can't immediately think of any good sentence with verb and then verb in different tenses. So I'm going to say, as a guessing method at least, that if you have a then with two verbs, you should have the same tense there. I don't. That's not a 100% rule. Don't use it as an actual elimination. Just use it as a guessing method if you have to. Okay, between D dog and E elephant, notice there's a message. The message is different. The message of D dog is so that these people, modifier, do not have to rely on translations. That's the point. She wrote these books so that they don't have to rely on translations. That is the sentence. That is the intended meaning. Choice E says that she wrote a textbook so that people can speak Spanish. Like, as though those people were unable to speak Spanish until she published a textbook. That's weird. I mean, yeah, you could publish like a, traveler's guide to Spanish so that people can speak Spanish quickly and easily while traveling. Yeah, something like that. But the best answer to this question is who cares, not you, because the answer choices don't do that. So this is a non-issue. But in general, I don't see any easy way to do that, at least not while keeping good formal writing. But the best answer is you don't care, because you're not editing or writing sentences. So no, I can't think of any easy way to make a substantially more concise sentence. I mean, you could say Spanish speakers, and there are people who speak Spanish, but that's not really a big difference. Okay, we are way over time here. We have more of these, so that's probably what's going to happen in the next session. But I am going to shut down the shop here and close down. Thank you guys for attending, and we are going to have the next study hall. I want to say that thanks for the kind words. I want to say that it is 2 weeks from now at the same time. I'm not 100% sure, so go ahead and just check the page. Whatever it says on the page is a thing. Yeah, I'm not a beer guy at all, actually, but thanks. Diet Mountain Dew. It's my magic juice, man. All right, let's kill this thing. Thank you guys, and I will talk to you soon.